Hello everyone, my name is Jane Nicholson-Biss. I'm the event manager working with the Institute of Leadership and Management. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. It's my great pleasure to introduce Kate Cooper, Head of Research Policy and Standards at the Institute of Leadership and Management. Kate, over to you.
Hello everybody, and thanks very much for joining us today. It might seem a bit unusual that we have a webinar entitled Collaboration, Dealing with Conflict. But of course, when people work together, there will be differences, and it's the difference that gives the creative tension, that gives rise to new ideas and new ways of working, because of course we're not all the same. And David has been working in this area of not all being the same for the past 20 years. He's been successfully promoting the principles and practices of mediation and non-violence across numerous walks of life, including neighbourhoods, schools, prisons, workplaces, and of course, boardrooms. I'd say that David's been instrumental in transforming attitudes to conflict management, taking a so much less adversarial approach, which essentially is what mediation is, as a credible and mainstream activity for some of the most well-known and valued brands. It's collaborative by nature, having built partnerships with business leaders, public servants and politicians not only in the UK, but also globally. So we're delighted to have David with us today. Thank you very much. Thank you, of course, for attending, and over to you, David.
Wow, what an introduction, Kate. Thank you so much. And Jane, thank you also for inviting me to share insights and thoughts in relation to this challenging but ubiquitous topic of how managers and leaders can deal with the issue of conflict resolution. So this webinar is part of the Institute of Leadership and Management's Dimensions of Great Leadership webinar series, and namely focusing on authenticity, vision, achievement, ownership, and of course collaboration. And each of the 49 webinars focuses on one of the components of each dimension, highlighting essential learning to assist your leadership development. And those webinars are recorded and available through the Institute's website and available for you to access. So collaborative leaders know how to resolve issues and how to deal with difference and identify constructive and collaborative remedies to challenging situations in the workplace. And this series is about helping to resolve issues, motivate and engage others, and promoting great colleagues and helping to manage difference, Kate, as you've rightly indicated. Of course, there are other areas that have been topics for the webinar series, including running meetings, communication, which clearly is a key and integral part of collaboration, engaging others and respecting different cultures. Some fantastic webinars that the Institute have been promoting for leaders and managers. But today's webinar will focus on the topic of conflict and the management of conflict, and how leaders can help generate collaboration at times of crisis, communication at times of change and discord within their teams. So collaborative leader deals effectively with conflict. In fact, I would go as far as to say that it's a core part of how leaders and managers function. It's about helping people to drive better outcomes and create innovative and creative solutions to often tough and intangible business problems. Conflict, as we'll see, is a ubiquitous and in many senses an inevitable part of working life. So throughout the webinar, we'll focus on how to deal with conflict. We'll look at the importance of having those difficult conversations, those courageous conversations to bring people together to drive collaboration. We'll look at conflict procedures and how they operate within organisations, and how organisations can embed mediation principles and practices into their discipline and grievance procedures, but also make greater use of resolution approaches to drive collaboration within their procedures. And as Kate said, I'm a mediator by background. I've been mediating in many cases over the last 20+ years. And of course, we'll focus today on the role that mediation is playing in helping create collaborative outcomes to difficult, challenging problems. So here we have two quotes, very powerful quotes. I think what Peter Honey's saying there is that that conflict is always going to happen, and I would certainly share that view. I think on the big C that Peter's talking about, we might be thinking here about the low-level petty stuff, quarrels, disagreements, not seeing eye to eye. But we know if those small c conflicts aren't resolved constructively or collaboratively, or if those issues are avoided or not dealt with, then they can escalate into those big C conflicts. And this is where it becomes very challenging. We often think about those big C conflicts. I think of them as GBH, grievance, bullying, and harassment. And that's how it often feels when people are in those big C conflicts. Very damaging, very destructive, and very harmful. But they're all conflicts, and they can all be resolved. And generally, they all follow a fairly predictable life cycle and pattern. And we'll look at that over the course of the webinar and look at how leaders and managers can be instrumental in resolving issues. And as Laura Berger says, it's not running away from conflict or burying our head in the sand or hoping it will go away. It doesn't go away. It won't go away. It's what I call conflict creep. It creeps around the organization, pops up every now and again and might explode. But it can be very challenging and very difficult to resolve that. I hope that as a result of the webinar, rather than running away from conflict, we can perhaps run towards it and see how we can add value to the conflict and handle it better so that it becomes much more manageable. So there are two forms of conflict. Some people automatically assume conflict is a clash, a war, a battle. If we go on to look at definitions of conflict, it's often defined in terms of dysfunction or negativity or destructive outputs. So it's destructive. But destructive conflict builds walls. It results in stress and stress-related symptoms, and I'm sure you're familiar with some of those, which can then result in absence and attrition. And these destructive conflict is often as a result of a release of cortisol, the stressor hormones that we anticipate, where we anticipate a fear of attack from the other person. They can also result in a perception of loss, a loss of faith, a loss of esteem, a loss of hope. So individuals in destructive conflict experiencing a profound sense of loss, a profound sense of stress, the release of powerful hormones, cortisol, and that can lock them into a pattern of behavior. But the good news is it doesn't have to be that way. All conflicts are not dysfunctional or destructive. If we make the right choices, and I'll underline the word choices, if we make the right choices when we're in conflict, it can become constructive. It can become functional. In fact, I would go as far as to say that, well, when it's handled well, conflict can underpin competitive advantage and generate innovative and creative teams and solutions to business problems. So constructive conflict, it builds bridges. It's about promoting empathy, insight, understanding, meaning. And in these cases, rather than releasing cortisol, the stressor hormones, we're more likely to see a release of dopamine, endorphin, serotonin, oxytocin. And of course, these are the feel-good hormones. These are the hormones that can help turn a complex problem into a potentially manageable solution. They can act as a bridge, bringing people together and unlock the potential, the brilliance that our teams have. Conflict can actually, when it's managed well, unlock that. So the consequences of not handling conflict and it moving into the destructive phase, it's a waste of time, effort, and energy. And I meet so many people who are experiencing dysfunctional conflict and destructive conflict who say to me, David, I walk into work with bricks in my belly. It's very hard to be an engaged, motivated, high-performing employee when we're walking around the corridors of our organisations with bricks in our belly. Some people, of course, are sat at home watching Homes Under the Hammer. Well, we can't resolve tough business challenges watching Homes Under the Hammer. So it has a significant and profound impact for individuals, a very powerful impact. I can see it etched in people's faces when I'm working with them. But of course, when we make the choices to engage in constructive conflict, wow, real change can happen. We can see new ideas being generated. It can really bring people together and align those people with the objectives of the organisation and helping them to feel really engaged, real meaning, real sense of purpose and belonging. And that sense of team identity can be fulfilled and enhanced as a result of the management of the conflict. So ACAS here promoting, as many would, a very sensible approach to resolution of conflict, and it's informal. Now, informal, don't think informal as skipping through the meadows singing Kumbaya, having a big hug, or a cup of tea, or pink or fluffy. Think of informal as being tough, challenging, difficult conversations, not seeing eye to eye, but listening, recognizing our differences, but also those areas we have in common. And the more organisations can do to promote informal resolution, to encourage that kind of dialogue, the more we'll see organisations promoting a culture of constructive, collaborative, compassionate, dispute resolution within their organisations. I'm a massive fan of the work of Thomas Kilmann. This was generated in 1976, and this model explains an awful lot to us about how we might behave during times of conflict, discord, or disharmony within our teams. In the left-hand corner, the bottom left, we look at avoidance. Avoidance perhaps is delaying, and that we might be avoiding because we haven't got the confidence to be able to assert our position, and we're not concerned so much about our needs or the needs of the other party being met. So we avoid dealing with the situation. We walk away. We live another day. The issue, of course, is we don't get the problem resolved. Sometimes, however, we might look for a very cooperative solution, but we're not able to assert our goals and needs. So we accommodate, we smooth over troubled waters. That can be great in terms of creating team harmony, but it doesn't necessarily encourage us to communicate and assert our needs and goals clearly and coherently. In the top left-hand corner is the competition, the forcing. Very assertive, some may say aggressive. Very concerned about pushing their needs and their goals, perhaps less concerned about identifying cooperative solutions. And we all know at some times we may adopt that approach, as we may many others. In the centre is we might try and find middle ground, some form of a compromise. But as a mediator, my eye is drawn immediately to the top right-hand corner, collaboration. Coming together and identifying our underlying interests and needs, communicating them in a way which is meaningful, listening to each other, developing empathetic, insightful conversations in order to be able to find an outcome which is mutually acceptable and is aligned to each individual's needs and goals. And when I'm working with teams or individuals in conflict, the areas of collaboration that I spend a lot of time focusing on is the area of building trust, building mutual respect within the team, and developing improved levels of communication. Trust, respect, communication. And that's often at the heart of the beginnings of a constructive dispute resolution process and driving collaboration. It's an aspiration, but it's a very important aspiration for us to work towards the win-win outcome. So difficult conversations, we've talked already about the stresses, that activation of the amygdala. It can make us feel uncomfortable, we can feel it. The vagus nerve you may be familiar with, it sends signals across our body, that's why we feel sick. So the idea, I was speaking to a lady, she said sometimes she sees her manager's car in the car park and she goes behind a bush and she is sick. Wow, I mean, that's just unbelievable. And that's about how our brain is connected to the rest of our body, in particular our gut and our stomach. So it's a very powerful, we can't ignore this. It's a very powerful response of anxiety and fear. And fear is often a big blocker to having these conversations, and it causes us to avoid them. But as Forbes rightly say, if we avoid those conversations, it can lead to dysfunction and lack of performance. And conversely, if we can have those powerful conversations, then we can turn underperformance into performance, and we can drive positive impacts within our teams. And think of the difficult conversation as giving the other person a jolly good listening to. And this is where I think we sometimes go wrong with a difficult conversation. We go in armed to the teeth with facts and evidence and emails and all of the information and data that we need as leaders and managers. And we tell the person what's wrong. We tell them what the solutions are. But what I would suggest we'd be better off doing is leave all of those files and those notes and those documents on your desk. Walk into the room with a cup of tea, sit down and give the other person a jolly good listening to. Let them talk. Let them explain what the issues are. Let them describe to you what they see as the challenges, and listen to them and hear them. And in so doing, we're able then to respond and react to what people are saying. It's important we respond non-defensively and we react in a positive and constructive way to allow the other person to be heard. And do you know something that I find incredible? Is they know what the problems are already. And in some respects, as we're listening to them, they become more self-critical and more self-aware and gain more meaning and insight as a result of being heard. And the deeper the insight that we can have from within ourselves, the more likely we are to be able to change our own behaviours. This slide is fantastic. For me, this captures everything that we could possibly ever hope to need in terms of managing conflict. I wish I had a whole day to spend with you talking through it, but I picked out 4 of the key issues which I think are particularly pertinent and relevant, but I would suggest all of them are. And there's a wonderful fact sheet on this webinar, which I'll suggest downloading as well. It's only a couple of slides, but it's got some really powerful and useful tools and resources to help you manage conflict. So what are the 4 areas I think are particularly critical? Well, number 1, empathy. Wow, step into their shoes. Try and imagine what the world looks like through their eyes. It can be very difficult and it can be very hard to do, but it's not impossible. And in so doing, we can really start to get a sense of what's happening for that individual. We can't feel their pain, but we can start to try and understand what it might be like for them. And when people are empathetic with us, and I'm sure you've had people empathetic with you, you know it feels good. And that feel good is a chemical reaction going on in our minds as we're removing that cortisol response or that fear and replacing it with something different. And empathy is a massive driver to helping people become self-aware and change. Emotional intelligence. So let's give people a chance to feel heard and valued and have that meaning. The next one is to move into what I call the 4 A's. Acknowledge how the person's feeling. Affirm how they're feeling. Affirm that it's okay to be distressed, confused, anxious and worried. That's okay. We can be appreciative of that. We can be empathetic of that. We can start to identify what's going wrong, what are the challenges, but also what's going well. Appreciative inquiry, focus on the good as well as some of the challenges. And now as a leader and a manager, we can do something really powerful. We can begin to ask questions. What's happening? Why is it happening? Who's involved? What could we be doing better? What could we be doing differently? Really engaging the individual to help us to understand the problems and the challenges. The next one is about objectivity. If we walk into the room, and I think this is very much about focusing on, in terms of World Cup parlance, which is obviously the World Cup is on at the moment. It's about attacking the ball and not the player. Don't go in with a set of assumptions, or be aware of your unconscious biases. Don't make judgment. Don't turn the problem into the person. The person is not the problem. The situation is the problem. So how can you and I work together to resolve this problem that is a shared problem? What do you need to happen? This is what I need to happen. Are our needs convergent? Are they shared? So objectivity and compassion are very powerful, not just ethically and morally, but from the perspective of helping us to find new solutions and new challenges, new outcomes to challenges. Again, I could say so much on all of these, but the final one I'm going to mention is using I statements, talking from the I. If someone points a finger at me, I immediately react and feel defensive. And what's the best form of defense? Attack. And we don't want that dynamic in a conversation. We want to be able to help people to talk to us and share with us their insights so we can do the same. So instead of you've done this, I've observed this happening. It's not an attack anymore. We're not going to instill that defend and attack dynamic in the room. I've observed this. This is how it's affected me. What have you observed happening? How's it affected you? That's a very different dynamic and a very different conversation. So instead of pointing the finger, turn it back. What have I seen? What have I observed? Using more neutral language. Let's move on to mediation. So mediation is a process of helping to resolve issues and disputes in a constructive and collaborative way. It involves a third party who's objective and neutral to help facilitate a dialogue that helps bring a resolution that's acceptable to all. And there are key underlying principles that are important to stress in the mediation process. It should be a voluntary process where all parties participate of their own willingness. Now, that's not to say that organisations can't put enormous pressure on people to engage in a dialogue process and design it into their systems and processes, but ultimately the decision lies with the individuals concerned. But there's so much more we could be doing to help parties collaborate and participate in the process. It opens up a discussion. It opens up rather than closes down a discussion. The mediator's not there to take sides. They're not there to tell people what to do. They're not there to tut or to form a judgment. They're there simply to help people to listen and to hear one another. And to recognise that in order for that to happen, there needs to be a perception of fairness and justice that is endemic and systemic within the mediation process. So the mediator is very acutely aware of ensuring that everyone has the equal opportunity to participate fully. And then finally, the agreement between our parties needs to be smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, resourced within a timescale. But it's their agreement. It's not my agreement as the mediator. It's their agreement. These are their words. And it's about building a resolution and a framework on how they can work together in the future based on the agreement that they forge. And over 90% of cases that go through mediation are successfully resolved. It's an incredible statistic. It's incredibly successful. And why is it so successful? It's because the parties in a dispute already know the answers to the problems. They don't need a panel. They don't need an investigation. They need an opportunity to reflect on their own behaviour and critically to be able to understand the impact of their behaviour on the other person, and the person who's affected to understand the intention that was behind the behaviour in the first place. And as a mediator, my experience is that the intention is often benign or indeed positive, but it's seen as something which is malignant and destructive. There's a disconnect between intent and impact, and that develops perceptions and fears that put a barrier in the way of the relationship. If we can remove those barriers and help the parties talk about intent and impact, they can have a very powerful coming together and conversation. So finally, moving to the last couple of slides, I think it's about looking now at how do we institutionalize these kind of thinking around collaborative, constructive, compassionate dispute resolution. Within a formal disciplinary and grievance processes, it's about raising issues at an earlier stage, being consistent, where necessary, investigate the facts, do a fact find in order to be able to go back and then help the parties find the most appropriate route to resolution. But more and more organisations now are starting to see the need to move away from what I call the classic GBH policies, grievous bodily harm policies, or grievance, bullying and harassment policies, to a more future-focused or solution-focused policy called a resolution policy. And more organisations are moving towards a resolution policy which would replace their traditional grievance, bullying and harassment procedures. Now, those policies are about dialogue, they're about mediation, they're about early intervention, they're about management action, they're about HR acting in a coaching and mentoring way. There's still full compliance with the ACAS code, of course, there would need to be. However, it's about driving a culture rather than taking out a grievance, the individual requests resolution. Now, isn't that a potentially very powerful start to a very collaborative conversation between two people? So final thoughts then, if you're a leader, you are going to deal with conflict, and that's not a bad thing. We can be afraid of conflict, or we can embrace it and run towards it. In actual fact, once we're dealing with the conflict, I'll give you a very short example. If a manager or leader is dealing with a conflict between two parties, and it's as a result of someone getting information late in the day, they're producing reports which are inaccurate, they're being seen to be underperforming, it's creating a lot of stress in the relationship. Not only if through a dialogue can the manager resolve the underlying stresses, they can see that maybe the flow of information in their team is causing problems and stress for the individuals. So the conflict management process allows the manager and leader to bring the parties together to have a conversation, but could actually result in systemic change in the way that information flows within the team. And this is where the management of conflict becomes a value add to the management and leadership function. So it's about managing conflict. It's imperative to generating the trust, maintaining confidence, and being able to handle it effectively and find sustainable outcomes and followership. Some amazing resources here. These obviously be made available to you, but there's lots of reports, there's clearly lots of information and publications and case studies in relation to how organisations are finding new and innovative solutions to this challenging issue. So thank you very much. For more information, as I've said, I've referred you already to the fact sheet, and I'll hand Jane and Kate over to yourselves.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, David, for that. We have questions coming in, and I know we don't have much time, so I'll crack on. Please. Does a mediator need to be neutral or external to the conflict in order to be successful in mediating? Or they're suggesting, could you be close to or involved and still be successful?
Yeah. The answer is yes to both, Kate. As a good proper mediator's answer, I think organisations already possess the most diplomatic, most highly effective mediators in their organisations, and that's their management and leadership population. So a good manager or leader can be neutral. We're already being neutral and impartial. Hiring processes, performance processes, there are handling discipline, absence. There are so many areas where we need to act with integrity and neutrality. And this handling of conflict is simply an extension of that. So I already see enormous capability for diplomacy. And if we might not be doing it in the workplace, we're certainly doing it at the dining room table at home, Kate, every day as well, dealing with difficult issues. So we already have these intrinsic capacity and skills to managing conflict. But of course, the other aspect of being an effective leader is knowing sometimes this dripping tap, I can't fix it. I need help. It's just about where do I go for help? And that's where sometimes someone who's external, that might be an internal mediator who's not part of the division or the department, or someone who's from outside of the organisation who has absolutely no vested interest or knowledge of the organisation. But I think the answer is both. Those skills already exist, and I think the more we can do to harness those skills and maximise those inner diplomats that we all have, the better we will be at developing collaborative outcomes.
We'll see how you cope with this question then. What about a situation when somebody is just wrong and needs to be told that?
Oh, lovely. We're all wrong all the time. We're all right all the time. The sense of being wrong is a subjective analysis on the part of the other person. And the question is do they need to be told that, or do they need to understand the other person's perspective in order that they can understand how the other person might be reacting to their behaviour? What's the intention behind the wrongness? Why are they being wrong? What impact is their wrongness having? What's their version of the truth? Are we able to listen to that? And when we're working with mediation, it's very clear to me very quickly that we move away very quickly from this right or wrong, win or lose, attack or defend sort of dynamic to two, and in some respects, those dynamics create this sort of parent-child kind of relationship, and it can become quite adversarial. What we're looking for in an adult-to-adult conversation is that two people can recognise that they're not entirely right, they're not entirely wrong, they have thoughts, they have feelings, they've acted in a particular way. And in that adult-to-adult conversation, it's about having a shared understanding that we can all move forward together and find a solution that's satisfactory for all of us. So in some respects, mediation is about that adult-to-adult conversation rather than that reductive right, wrong, win, lose approach, which we're so familiar with and is so common.
Thank you. Do you think mediators need to be formally trained?
Yes, I do. I think, as I've said, people on this webinar, many managers and leaders, they're probably dealing with this stuff day in and day out and don't even realise they're using a lot of the skills that I would use as a professional mediator. So on one level, release your inner diplomat. If you're going back to your office after this webinar and you're thinking, oh, I've got a bit of a challenging situation with Fred or Joanne, go and talk to them, go and listen to them. This is not rocket science, it's not that complicated. So on one level, we don't need to make it overly complicated. But conversely, these are tough issues, particularly when we're getting into the areas of bullying, harassment, discrimination, and more challenging situations. So yes, of course, training in mediation skills, in negotiation skills can and are very, very important. As are skills in being able to have those difficult conversations. That slide with all the bullet points on it, that's a whole course just on that one slide. So again, I'm going to have to say yes and no. I feel like I'm probably really sitting on the fence, Kate. On one hand, yes, of course, absolutely, training is critical. But on the other hand is go and have a go. What can go wrong if you give another person a jolly good listening to? And what can go wrong if you give them some empathy? What can go wrong if you try and understand what's happening for them and explain to them what's happening for you? So both, I'm afraid to say.
Right, so one final question, which is going to be huge for you to answer in a minute.
Wow, okay, I'll try.
We want your advice, please, for approaching people whose reluctance to change is preventing the business from progressing.
Wow, that is a great question, thank you. So, I hear this a lot. She'll never change. No, can't change. Leopard will never change its spot. And of course, I can confront that attitude. Well, give me some evidence. What's she doing wrong? Why is she not willing to change? What's your viewpoint? Or I could ask some questions. So explain to me, I hear what you're saying is you need her to change. If she were to change, what would she be doing differently? If she were more open to change, how would she be demonstrating that? What do you need her to be doing? What do you think she needs from the change process? Have you had a conversation about what's important to you? And have you listened to what's important to her? Have you identified areas of commonality and convergence and overlap in what your needs are? And how will you handle difference? Is her reluctance to change and resistance to the change process a barrier, or is it an opportunity? And if we have the conversation and understand her needs and goals, could that mean she becomes an advocate and a champion of the change process? So we can reframe the language and reframe the mindset and open up a dialogue. And through those change processes, some of the most powerful advocates and drivers and champions of change are those folk who at the very beginning were the most hardened cynics and skeptics. And we need to go up to those cynics and skeptics and give them a big metaphorical hug. And what I mean by the big metaphorical hug is we need to give them, you've guessed it, a jolly good listening to, and then begin to ask questions. And then we can start to open up a dialogue and actually identify what the challenges are. And they'll tell us if we listen to them.
We've just had a clarification on that. Rather than the person themselves needing to change, but I think it's probably your answer will be part of the same thing. It's their resistance to changes in the business that is preventing progress.
Well, I think it's an interesting concept that and the clarification. I understand the clarification. I understood the question as well. I think change comes from within, and change creates conflict. So when we experience change, we experience often an inner conflict. Do I support on one hand the change, or do I oppose on the other hand the change? And that can create an inner conflict, and that inner conflict can then play out as behaviour, and those behaviours can be seen as barriers and blockers to the change process. So my answer, I'll stick with the original answer, if I may, even though I understand that this is more a question around systemic and wider issues, because I think if we can understand what's happening in the inner conflict, then we can help to understand why that might be driving particular behaviours, which in and of themselves are opposing a wider organisational change. And by focusing on the individual and their own reaction to the change, it can then help us to understand and build bridges with that individual so that they can then adjust or transform their perception of the change process. So I really appreciate the clarification, but I think I'm going to stick with the original answer.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry to all of you who've sent in questions that we haven't got time for today, but it was a great presentation, really interesting questions. Really do appreciate everyone's involvement and participation. Thank you again, David, and back to you, Jane.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Kate. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. On behalf of the Institute of Leadership and Management and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.